On the morning of June 9, 53 BC, the desert near the small Mesopotamian town of Carrhae shimmered under a ruthless sun. The heat pressed down on iron helmets and mail shirts as tens of thousands of Roman soldiers stood in formation, far from the green hills and paved roads that had always favored their legions. At their head stood Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men Rome had ever produced, a conqueror of Spartacus, a consul, and a member of Rome's most powerful political alliance. He believed that one bold decision would crown his life with military glory equal to Pompey and Julius Caesar. Instead, that single decision would tear a Roman army apart, shatter the eastern frontier, and mark one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. The world that led Crassus to Carrhae was one defined by ambition and rivalry. By the mid-1st century BCE, Rome had become the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Its legions had crushed Carthage, subdued Greece, and marched deep into Asia Minor and Syria. Yet Rome's greatest men were no longer satisfied with collective victory. They sought personal immortality through conquest. Crassus had money beyond imagination, Pompey had fame and victories, and Caesar was carving his legend in Gaul. Crassus alone lacked a conquest that could rival theirs. Wealth could buy armies and influence, but it could not buy glory. That hunger drove him eastward, toward a land and an enemy he did not fully understand. The Parthian Empire lay beyond Rome's eastern provinces, stretching across modern Iran and Mesopotamia. It was not a barbarian kingdom in the Roman sense, but a sophisticated state with its own traditions of warfare, diplomacy, and rule. Roman writers often underestimated Parthia, mistaking its decentralized aristocracy for weakness. Crassus made the same error. He believed Parthia would collapse under the weight of a disciplined Roman advance, just as other eastern kingdoms had done before. His fatal decision was not merely to go to war, but to fight a war of his own choosing, ignoring advice, geography, and intelligence. Crassus received the province of Syria in 55 BCE, granting him command of legions already stationed along Rome's eastern frontier. From the start, his intentions were clear. Without provocation or Senate approval, he planned an invasion of Parthian territory. Many in Rome opposed the campaign. Some tribunes declared it illegal. Omens were reported as unfavorable. Even common citizens shouted curses as Crassus left the city. He dismissed them all. To Crassus, hesitation meant losing the chance to rival Caesar's victories in Gaul. The initial stage of the campaign seemed to justify his confidence. In 54 BC, Crassus crossed the Euphrates and seized several Parthian towns with little resistance. Instead of consolidating these gains, securing supply lines, and waiting for reinforcements, he withdrew for the winter. This pause gave the Parthians time to prepare. It also revealed Crassus's first major error. He treated the war as a raid for glory, not a sustained campaign against a capable enemy. When spring came in 53 BCE, Crassus advanced again. This time he rejected the advice of local allies who urged him to follow the Euphrates, where water, food, and naval support could protect his army. Instead, he chose to march directly across open desert toward the Parthian heartland. The decision was influenced by a local guide, whose loyalty was questionable, and by Crassus's desire for speed and surprise. In reality, it exposed his legions to the worst possible conditions and robbed them of strategic flexibility. Crassus commanded approximately 7 legions, around 40,000 infantry, supported by cavalry and light troops. These soldiers were trained for close combat, shield walls, and decisive engagements. Their strength lay in discipline and cohesion. Parthian warfare was built on entirely different principles. The Parthian army relied on highly mobile horse archers and heavily armored cataphracts. They avoided close combat unless it favored them, preferring to exhaust enemies from a distance. Crassus either did not understand this doctrine or believed Roman courage could overcome it. The Parthian response was led by Shorna, one of the empire's most capable generals. He commanded a force far smaller than the Roman army, but it was perfectly suited to the terrain and tactics of Mesopotamia. Shorna did not rush to meet Crassus in a conventional battle. Instead, he allowed the Romans to advance deeper into hostile territory, stretching their supply lines and draining their strength. When the time came, he struck with precision. Near Carrhae, the Roman army finally encountered the Parthians. Crassus arranged his legions into a massive hollow square, hoping to defend against encirclement. It was a formation designed for survival, not victory. Once the Parthian horse archers began their attack, the floors became clear. Arrows rained down in endless waves, striking shields, armor, and exposed flesh. The Romans could not pursue their attackers, who retreated effortlessly out of reach. When Roman units attempted to break formation, they were isolated and destroyed. Crassus's son, Publius, led a cavalry charge in an attempt to drive off the Parthian horse archers. Young, brave, and eager to prove himself, Publius pushed too far. Shorna lured him into a trap, surrounding his force and annihilating it. Publius was killed, and his severed head was later displayed to the Roman lines. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman morale collapsed as hope drained away under the desert sun. By nightfall, the Roman army was broken, but not yet destroyed. Crassus ordered a retreat toward Carrhae, abandoning the wounded. Confusion, exhaustion, and despair spread through the ranks. What had begun as a campaign for glory was turning into a struggle for survival. The fatal decision to march into the desert without secure supply lines or proper intelligence had set events in motion that Crassus could no longer control. The Battle of Carrhae was not yet over, but its outcome was already sealed. Crassus had underestimated his enemy, overestimated his own abilities, and ignored every warning sign along the way. The Roman Republic would soon pay the price for his ambition, not only in lost lives, but in a profound shift in the balance of power between Rome and Parthia. Carrhae would echo through history as a lesson written in blood, showing how one decision made for personal glory could undo the might of Rome itself. Night fell over the plain near Carrhae with a silence that felt unnatural after the chaos of the day. The Roman army, once the embodiment of order and confidence, now stumbled through darkness and fear. Fires were forbidden, orders were confused, and the wounded cried out only to be left behind. The desert that Crassus had chosen as a short-cut now became a trap, offering neither shelter nor guidance. In this moment, the full weight of his decision began to crush the army he commanded. As dawn approached on June 10, 53 BC, the Romans attempted to regroup near the city of Carrhae, a modest settlement that offered walls and temporary safety. Yet even here, Crassus failed to assert firm control. His officers disagreed on whether to remain, retreat, or negotiate. The legions were exhausted, dehydrated, and psychologically shattered. The Parthians, by contrast, were fresh, disciplined, and confident. Shorna understood that victory did not require a final assault. The Romans were already collapsing under the pressure of fear and uncertainty. During the night retreat, thousands of Roman soldiers had become separated from their units. Some wandered into the desert and died of thirst. Others were hunted down by Parthian patrols. Entire cohorts vanished without a fight. By morning, Crassus no longer commanded a unified army, but fragments of one. The hollow square that had failed to protect them in daylight was now impossible to maintain in darkness and confusion. Shorna moved swiftly to exploit this weakness. Instead of attacking the fortified town, he surrounded it, cutting off escape routes and denying access to water and supplies. His messengers approached the Roman lines under flags of truce, offering negotiations. To the desperate soldiers inside Carrhae, this appeared as a chance for survival. To Crassus, it was a humiliation he could barely endure. Yet his authority was eroding. Roman officers and soldiers openly demanded talks, believing that continued resistance would lead only to annihilation. This moment marked another fatal turning point. Crassus agreed to meet Shauna, not as a conqueror dictating terms, but as a defeated commander seeking mercy. The meeting was arranged outside the city walls. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next, but all agree on the result. During the tense negotiations, a scuffle broke out, whether by accident or design. Crassus was killed, along with several senior officers. His death was sudden, violent, and deeply symbolic. The man who had sought eternal glory died in confusion, surrounded by enemies far from Rome. The death of Crassus did not end the disaster. Without their commander, Roman resistance collapsed entirely. Thousands surrendered. Others attempted escape and were cut down. It is estimated that around 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed at Carrhae, with another 10,000 captured. These prisoners were marched east into Parthian territory, never to return to Rome. Some ancient sources claim they were settled along distant frontiers, possibly as forced labor or military colonists. Whether these stories are true or embellished, they reflect the scale of Rome's humiliation. The Parthians treated the victory as more than a battlefield success. They understood its psychological and political value. According to Roman historians, Crassus's severed head was used as a prop in a Parthian court performance of a Greek tragedy, a grim mockery of Roman ambition and arrogance. Even if partially symbolic, the story captured how completely the balance of power had shifted. Rome, which had grown accustomed to victory, now faced a peer enemy that could not be bullied or underestimated. The Battle of Carrhae exposed fundamental weaknesses in Roman military thinking. Roman legions were optimized for close combat, rigid formations, and decisive engagements. Against Parthian mobility, distance warfare, and psychological pressure, these strengths became liabilities. Crassus had failed to adapt. He brought an army designed for European battlefields into a landscape where speed and flexibility mattered more than discipline alone. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. In Rome, news of the defeat sent shockwaves through the political system. Crassus had been one of the three pillars of the First Triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. His death shattered the fragile balance of power. Without Crassus's wealth and influence to mediate between his rivals, tensions between Caesar and Pompey escalated rapidly. Within a few years, Rome would descend into civil war. Strategically, Carrhae marked the eastern limit of Roman expansion for generations. Rome did not attempt another large-scale invasion of Parthia for decades, and even later emperors approached the eastern frontier with caution. The myth of Roman invincibility had been broken. Provinces and allies began to question whether Rome could truly protect them against eastern powers. Parthia, once dismissed as a secondary threat, emerged as a long-term rival that Rome would struggle to contain. Crassus's reputation suffered irrevocably. Roman writers portrayed him as greedy, arrogant, and blind to reality. His wealth, once admired, was now seen as a corrupting force that had driven him to reckless war. While this portrayal was shaped by hindsight and political bias, it reflected a broader Roman fear of ambition unchecked by wisdom. Carrhae became a moral lesson as much as a military one, a warning about the dangers of personal glory overriding collective responsibility. For the soldiers who survived, Carrhae was a trauma that lingered long after the battle ended. Veterans returned with stories of arrows that never stopped coming, of enemies who could not be caught, and of commanders who led them into death without understanding the enemy they faced. These accounts influenced Roman military reforms and thinking, slowly encouraging greater emphasis on cavalry, auxiliary troops, and adaptability. The desert near Carrhae absorbed the blood of a Roman army, but its legacy did not fade with time. It reshaped Roman foreign policy, altered internal politics, and defined Rome's relationship with the East for centuries. The fatal decision that brought Crassus there was not simply a tactical error. but a failure of judgment rooted in pride and rivalry. Rome would recover, but it would never forget Carrhae. The aftermath of Carrhae unfolded slowly, but its damage cut deeply into the foundations of Roman power. In the weeks and months following the battle, scattered Roman survivors drifted back towards Syria with stories that sounded unreal to those who heard them. An entire consular army had been destroyed by an enemy Rome had barely taken seriously. Eagles had been lost. Legions had vanished. For a republic built on the idea that Roman arms were unstoppable, Carrhae was a wound to identity as much as to territory. The captured legionaries became living symbols of Roman failure. Tens of thousands were marched east under Parthian guard, stripped of their weapons and dignity. Ancient writers claim many were settled in distant regions of the Parthian Empire, possibly near the eastern frontiers facing nomadic tribes. While some later legends place their descendants as far away as Central Asia, what matters more than the literal truth is how these stories resonated in Rome. Roman citizens believed their soldiers had been erased from history, swallowed by the East, never to return. It reinforced the sense that Carrhae was not merely a defeat, but a disappearance. Politically, the shock was immediate. Crassus had been the financial engine of Roman elite politics, funding allies, bribing voters, and stabilizing rival factions. With his death, the uneasy balance holding the Republic together began to crack. Caesar was still campaigning in Gaul, building an army loyal to him personally. Pompey remained in Italy, increasingly aligned with the Senate. Without Crassus to mediate, suspicion hardened into hostility. Carrhae did not cause the Roman civil wars by itself, but it removed the final restraint that had kept the most powerful men in Rome from turning on each other. The Senate reacted with fear rather than confidence. Eastern provinces were reinforced, fortifications repaired, and governors instructed to avoid direct confrontation with Parthia. Rome's approach to the east became defensive, even cautious. The Euphrates, once viewed as a stepping stone to further conquest, became a psychological boundary. Beyond it lay humiliation and uncertainty. For decades, Roman commanders would remember Carrhae whenever discussions of invading Parthia arose. Parthia, meanwhile, emerged from the battle with newfound prestige. Shauna's victory demonstrated that Roman legions could be defeated by superior strategy rather than superior numbers. The Parthians did not attempt to conquer Roman territory on a large scale, but they did something arguably more important. They established themselves as equals. Diplomacy between Rome and Parthia after Carrhae was no longer conducted from a position of Roman dominance. Treaties, negotiations, and border disputes now carried the memory of Roman blood spilled in the desert. One of the most enduring symbols of the defeat was the loss of the legionary standards. These eagles represented Roman honor, discipline, and divine favor. Their capture was seen as a spiritual catastrophe. Roman writers described the loss as if Rome itself had been disarmed. Recovering those standards became an obsession for later leaders, not for military necessity, but for moral restoration. The memory of Carrhae lived on in these symbols, shaping Roman policy long after the battlefield had fallen silent. Militarily, Carrhae forced Rome to confront its limitations. The Roman army had conquered through standardization and discipline, but those strengths assumed a certain type of war. Against Parthian mobility, Roman rigidity became a weakness. Slowly, Rome adapted. Cavalry units were expanded. Missile troops were recruited from Eastern allies. Commanders became more cautious about terrain and supply lines. These changes did not erase Carrhae, but they were shaped by it. The figure of Crassus became a warning carved into Roman historical memory. He was portrayed as the embodiment of greed without wisdom, ambition without restraint. Ancient historians emphasized his wealth and downplayed his earlier successes, creating a moral narrative that framed Carrhae as inevitable punishment. While this portrayal was unfair in some respects, it reflected Rome's need to explain disaster in moral terms. A republic that believed itself favored by destiny could not easily accept defeat without assigning blame. Yet the deeper failure was systemic. Crassus was enabled by a political culture that rewarded personal glory over collective strategy. He bypassed the Senate, ignored experienced advisors, and treated war as a stage for self-promotion. Carrhae exposed how dangerous this culture had become. Rome was no longer fighting wars solely for survival or security, but for the reputations of individual men. In that sense, Carrhae was a symptom of the Republic's decline as much as a cause. In the eastern provinces, Roman authority weakened. Client kings and local elites, who had relied on Roman protection, now questioned whether Rome could defend them against Parthian pressure. Some hedged their loyalty, playing Rome and Parthia against each other. This instability would haunt Roman governors for generations. The East became a contested zone rather than a secure frontier. Even culturally, Carrhae left a mark. Roman literature and rhetoric began to reference Parthian arrows and elusive horsemen as symbols of fear and frustration. The East was no longer just exotic and wealthy. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of humiliating Rome. This shift in perception influenced how Romans understood their empire and their place in the world. Decades later, Roman leaders would still invoke Carrhae when debating Eastern campaigns. When Mark Antony launched his own invasion of Parthia, memories of Crassus's failure haunted every decision. Antony attempted to learn from Carrhae, bringing more cavalry and adjusting tactics, yet he too suffered disaster. The shadow of Carrhae stretched long, shaping Roman strategy even when Rome believed it had moved on. The battle also altered Rome's sense of destiny. Before Carrhae, Roman expansion seemed inevitable. After it, limits became visible. Rome could still conquer, but it could also lose. That realization, once planted, never fully disappeared. Carrhae taught Rome that power without understanding was fragile, and that enemies who fought differently could not be crushed by tradition alone. As years passed, the desert near Carrhae returned to silence. Bones were buried by sand, weapons rusted and vanished, yet the consequences of that single fatal decision continued to ripple outward, shaping politics, warfare, and identity. Carrhae was no longer just a place. It became a warning, spoken whenever ambition threatened to outrun judgment. The final legacy of Carrhae was written not only in defeat, but in how Rome tried to heal the wound it had inflicted upon itself. Years passed, regimes changed, and civil war consumed the Republic, yet the memory of that desert catastrophe refused to fade. Carrhae became a measuring stick against which later Roman leaders judged their own ambitions. It was invoked in speeches, whispered among generals, and embedded into Rome's collective memory as proof that power, when guided by pride rather than strategy, could unravel in a single season. As Rome descended into civil war, the consequences of Crassus's death became impossible to ignore. With one pillar of the political order gone, rivalry between Caesar and Pompey hardened into open conflict. The Republic fractured, and what followed reshaped Roman history forever. While Carrhae was not the sole cause of Rome's collapse into dictatorship, it accelerated the process by removing the last counterweight between two men who now stood poised for supremacy. In this way, a battle fought against Parthia indirectly determined the fate of Rome itself. After the dust of civil war settled and the Republic gave way to imperial rule, Rome's new leadership sought symbolic closure for the humiliation of Carrhae. The loss of the legionary standards still burned in Roman consciousness. They represented more than military equipment. They embodied honor, divine favor, and the promise of Roman superiority. Their absence was a constant reminder that Rome had been bested, not by chaos, but by a rival civilization that understood warfare differently. Decades later, the recovery of those standards became a political triumph rather than a military one. Through diplomacy rather than invasion, Rome secured their return from Parthia. When the standards were brought back, they were celebrated as if a great victory had been won. Temples were built, reliefs carved, and ceremonies staged to present the event as the symbolic reversal of Carrhae. Yet beneath the triumph lay an unspoken truth. Rome had not conquered Parthia. It had negotiated with it as an equal. This moment revealed how deeply Carrhae had altered Roman thinking. Before Crassus, Rome expanded by force, confident that its legions could overcome any foe. After Carrhae, Rome recognized limits. The eastern frontier became a place of balance rather than domination. Diplomacy, client kingdoms, and cautious campaigns replaced dreams of total conquest. Parthia remained unconquered, and Rome learned to live with that reality. Militarily, the Roman army evolved, but it never forgot the lesson of the desert. Commanders paid closer attention to terrain, supply, and enemy tactics. Auxiliary forces grew in importance, especially cavalry recruited from regions familiar with mobile warfare. Roman warfare became more flexible, but also more careful. Carrhae taught Rome that discipline alone could not compensate for strategic blindness. Culturally, the defeat reshaped how Romans understood their empire. Roman writers increasingly portrayed the East not as a passive prize to be seized, but as a complex and dangerous world with its own power centers. The Parthians were no longer dismissed as inferior opponents. They were respected, feared, and studied. Carrhae transformed Roman arrogance into wary realism. Crassus himself became a cautionary figure. His name was spoken alongside warnings about ambition unchecked by wisdom. Later generations reduced him to a symbol of greed and hubris, a man who mistook wealth for competence and courage for strategy. This portrayal was not entirely fair, but it served a purpose. Rome needed Carrhae to mean something beyond loss. By framing it as the consequence of one man's fatal decision, Romans could believe that disaster was avoidable, that the system itself was not entirely broken. Yet history suggests otherwise. Carrhae exposed structural flaws in Roman politics and command. Crassus was able to launch a massive war without broad approval, driven by personal rivalry rather than state necessity. His failure revealed how dangerous that freedom had become. In this sense, Carrhae was not an accident, but an outcome produced by a republic that rewarded ambition above restraint. Over time, Carrhae entered the Roman imagination as a turning point. It marked the moment when Rome learned it could bleed far from home, when destiny no longer guaranteed victory. Even centuries later, Roman emperors weighed eastern campaigns against the memory of that defeat. The desert near Carrhae became a silent boundary between confidence and caution. In world history, the Battle of Carrhae stands as more than a clash of armies. It represents a confrontation between two military systems, two political cultures, and two visions of power. Rome, built on heavy infantry and relentless expansion, collided with Parthia, a state defined by mobility, patience, and strategic restraint. The result was not just a Roman defeat, but a rebalancing of power between East and West. Crassus went to Carrhae seeking immortality. What he achieved instead was a lesson that outlived him. His fatal decision demonstrated that even the greatest empires could be undone by arrogance, poor judgment, and the refusal to listen. Carrhae did not destroy Rome in a single day, but it cracked the illusion of invincibility that had sustained Roman ambition for generations. That is why Carrhae still matters. It reminds us that history does not turn only on strength, but on understanding. Empires fall not when they lack power, but when they misuse it. In the desert of Mesopotamia, under an unforgiving sun, Rome learned that truth the hard way.